Good evening. My name is George Etheridge. I'm the conductor of the Capitol Wind Symphony here in Washington, D.C. Many years ago, I discovered or learned of the teaching techniques of Marcel Tabuteau, the great French oboist, who was with the Philadelphia Orchestra and who taught at Curtis. I discovered this information through a book called Note Groupings by James Thurman. And for a very long time, as teacher, as performer, as conductor, I've tried to impart these concepts to my players and my students. This summer, I was introduced to, for me, a new book called Sound and Motion by David McGill. Mr. McGill is the principal bassoonist of the Chicago Symphony. And I was so impressed by the thoroughness of the book, the accessibility of the book, and it is of the same subject of the music, of the teachings of Marcel Tabuteau, but certainly most comprehensive text on it I've ever seen. So one thing led to another, and we are fortunate enough to have David McGill with us tonight, and we will talk about his book, and we will use a couple of band pieces that should be very familiar to people to demonstrate some of the concepts. So David, welcome.
Thank you very much, George.
Glad to have you here.
I appreciate you inviting me here.
Tell us how you came to write the book. What was the impetus for that?
I was speaking with some students earlier, and they asked me just that question. I think one of the main reasons that I decided to write this book about the teaching that I got at Curtis was the fact that my teachers never wrote a book themselves. None of them wrote a book about musical phrasing. And it's often the case that performers who are busy in orchestras or in bands or conductors or whoever, they really have not much time on their hands to do this sort of thing. And I must tell you, I had to carve out large chunks of time just to write the book. It went on every vacation with me. It was on every beach I ever went to. You know, I printed out and I'd get sand in the pages.
It took 14 years to
It took 14 years from the inception of the very first ideas on paper to getting it printed by Indiana University Press. And so it was a tribute to my teachers and their ideas, which I felt that they had not been able to put on paper themselves.
Wonderful. Give us an idea of the impact of Marcel Tabuteau. I mean, I'm sure many people know his name, but can you give us a little bit of insight in that?
Well, as you say, many people do know his name, but there are a far larger number of people who do not know who Marcel Tabuteau was. Marcel Tabuteau came to this country in 1905 at the age of 17 as a graduate of the Paris Conservatory, and he immediately began to pick up new ideas, having come from this isolated, sort of insulated world in Paris. When he came to New York to play, he was influenced by the German English horn player. No, he came as the English horn player, but there was a German oboe player, and he was influenced by hearing this German oboe player, who was also in New York, hearing various American players and people who came from different countries. And so he began to fuse the best of what he heard in all of these styles into an amalgamated style, which now is recognizable as the American oboe style of playing, or they call it the Tabuteau style. Even in Europe, they'll use his name to identify it. But his influence reached far beyond the oboe world into all of the woodwind world and even the string world, because as the years passed by, after 1924, when the Curtis Institute was founded, and he became the oboe teacher there, from 24 to 54, 30 years, he taught the oboe players, the wind class, and even in the last 15 years or so, he taught a string phrasing class. So there are a whole slew of concert masters and principal cello players who came out of that school, and they all learned phrasing from this one man, this Marcel Tabuteau, who was just a little boy in France 50 years earlier. But when he left the United States to go back to France in his retirement, suddenly all of the major positions in the American orchestras were now filled by Americans. And before that, we had to import our talent. So we became a self-producing nation.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. It was a complete change.
Yeah. If you had to sort of capsulize the concept of the book, what was Tabuteau's main goal in his teaching of expression?
Forward motion. And this is where basically the title, Sound and Motion, comes from. Marcel Tabuteau was a firm believer that music is not notes. Music is what the notes do. In other words, they have to move. They have to have a progression towards a goal and perhaps a recession from that goal, but there has to be some sort of forward motion always happening in order for the music to be alive. And if you'll permit me, I'll use the little example that John Delancey used in our woodwind class. John Delancey succeeded Marcel Tabuteau as the oboe and woodwind instructor at Curtis after Tabuteau retired. And in our very first class, when I was 18 years old, he shot out this opening question where he said, "What is music?" Now you can imagine we were sitting there. I was a hayseed from Oklahoma. I didn't know what music was. You know, what kind of a question is that for a little kid like me? So anyway, we all sort of didn't know what to say, and he would point at us, and we'd have to say something. So we'd say, well, phrasing, tone, intonation, structure, whatever. There were all sorts of different answers that came out. This would go on for a little while, and someone finally said, sound. Well, there's your basic ingredient. So Delancey said, yes, sound is involved. That's the first thing you have to have. But what's the difference between any sound and musical sound? And of course, we were again nonplussed. We didn't know what to say. So as the class went along, he finally said, okay, I'm going to get your thinking going in a certain way. If you saw an animal sitting in a field at a great distance away, how would you know if that animal were alive? And of course, that brings forth the obvious response, if it moves. And so this was his whole point. In order for your music to be alive, it must move. It must go somewhere. And this wonderful little example immediately set the wheels turning in our minds so that we were suddenly thinking, well, how are we going to make our notes live? We didn't want to be playing just dead notes like we often heard. And it's possible to play whole concertos without making any music. It really is possible, and we all know it. But it's very hard to know what to do. And yet Tabuteau, and through Delancey at Curtis, was able to communicate the how and the why of it. Not just, you should make your music move forward.
Right.
Well, that's a very blanket statement, but he taught how.
Emotion, yeah. I love the beginning chapters in the book. There are two or three that are just so provocative. There's one called Fun. Can you tell us what fun is?
Well, I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't music, which doesn't mean that you won't experience sensations that are tremendously meaningful and deep and enjoyable, too. But I would not say, first of all, that the hours and years that are involved in practicing your scales and your long tones, making reeds, if you happen to be a wind player who plays a reed instrument, as fun. And all this hard work goes into creating a sense of fun, if we're having to be playing a very light waltz by Strauss or something like this that gives a lighthearted feeling. Well, the audience should feel that it's fun. However, the musicians are working very hard, if they're doing their jobs properly, to create a sensation or give the sensation of fun to the audience. It's really, what we do is we give so much. And you can only give these sensations if you're working to the utmost. And hard work is rarely fun, if you get what I mean. Sure. There is great enjoyment, there's great fulfillment. There are moments when I feel so moved that I almost feel like I can't play. You know, you get your eyes tear up, and you get so overwrought with the beauty of the music, and that in itself is something that shouldn't happen in a concert, because it certainly didn't help my vibrato. You know, and so there's a certain level of detachment that a real, I think, a true professional must have in order to avoid being affected by what you're doing to the point that it detracts from your musical performance. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you begin to think that things are so fun in the music too, you can begin to do things that are really just not right. They're too far off the wall, bizarre things that can happen. Mm-hmm. And they make, if you get too much into your own feelings, guess what? You forget that you're trying to communicate what the composer has given.
And that's the other chapter, the one on feelings. What do you think about that?
Well, again, I mean, I've touched on that with you know, those deep feelings of being moved almost to tears. I can remember certain Mozart piano concertos that we performed in Chicago with Daniel Barenboim. And there were moments when I felt like what he was doing on that stage there couldn't be anything on the face of the earth that was happening that would be more important than what I was witnessing. It was that kind of a feeling. And, the lump in the throat and all this other stuff happens again. You have to begin to say, okay, I've got to get away from that and get back to realizing I am on stage here to perform at my best. I'm not on stage here to just feel the music. Of course I'll feel something. But if I'm going to feel it so completely that I can't perform, then what's my purpose? I'm not there just to feel the music in a public act of kind of exhibitionism. It wouldn't be proper.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
What about the techniques we're going to talk about with capital winds in demonstration? What do you think about teaching these techniques to younger people? At what age would you think? Is there an age limit that one?
Well, you're speaking to someone here who has basically only worked with college level and up, because a lot of professionals have come to me for coachings and so forth. So I'm used to working with college, and I remember when I got to Curtis at the age of 18, this was almost as much as I could bite off and chew. But I have heard of other teachers who've worked with students, and if you focus the idea into simple note grouping, giving forward motion, using the numbers that Tabuteau used to use, he developed a whole system, which we now refer to as the Tabuteau number system, of teaching expression with numbers. And if you stick to that simple principle, much as Thurmond did in the book you mentioned before, which was a book I had read early on, that can get the thinking going in the proper direction. But there's a certain amount of life experience and other musical knowledge you have to gain before you can become a more complete performer. But of course, these early concepts, the number system, the early parts of the number system, the simpler parts, can be brought in high school, I think.
Good, yeah. Well, at this point, we're going to do a little bit of demonstration for you. I've chosen to play a couple of very familiar works for the band audiences. The first movement of the Gustav Holst E-flat Suite, the Chaconne movement. We'll start with that, and then I thought, what better vehicle than perhaps a Sousa March, so why not the most famous one, the Stars and Stripes. So we'll start with the Chaconne, and we're purposely going to play the Chaconne straight through, without any inflections at all. I mean, certainly the articulations and the dynamics that we will attempt to do those, but none of the other techniques that David will demonstrate after we play it.